Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back, everybody. There are many different modalities to help move your life forward, make you feel better, help you understand certain things, specifically why we act the way we do in different situations. One of them is IFS. We're going to dig back into that today and also define what the self is. Who are we? Essentially, he is a certified IFS therapist, EMDR therapist, PRT therapist, and he's back with us. Scott Moresi is back on the program. How are you today?
Doing good, Steve. How are you doing?
Very well, very well. Now, we've talked about IFS. How about a recap on that before we move forward?
Yeah, sure. So IFS, in contrast to like traditional talk therapy, where you sit down and you talk about the things that are going on, and there tends to be a tendency to kind of blend with the parts of us that are active, like an anxious part because of an angry boss, or a worried part because of maybe an illness or something like that, and so in traditional talk therapy, we sort of blend with those parts, become them, and act them out. And in IFS, we do exactly the opposite. We
Hmm.
unblend, we identify the parts as angry, mad, sad, glad, and we unblend with the parts into self as much as we can, into a self-led place. And then we attend to those parts. We give them what we came to the therapist for.
It's a real interesting concept when we start looking at who we are and that we have all these different parts. And when you sit with it, you start to think about it like, the part of me, when they say a part of me is, thinking
Yeah,
about this, it's really what it is. There's this
yeah.
a certain part
Mhm.
of you is here, certain part of you is here. Um,
Yeah.
can you define maybe, I don't know, two or three parts, if you gave them a label, what they might be?
Yeah, yeah. There's three different types of parts, right? There's the managers in our lives, like critics, perfectionists, hypervigilant parts. They are proactive and they kind of try to keep things on track.
Hmm.
And usually, like a critic is maybe telling us we're no good because there's a part of us that believes it. And that part that believes it probably is like an exile that we might call shame or unworthiness or not good enough in some way. And that's usually a young part that believes it's no good, and the critic is actually trying to protect it from feeling that way. Unfortunately, it doesn't realize that it's causing the problem it's trying to prevent. And then usually in polarity to the critic part, there's some kind of oppositional part, like a procrastinator or a distracting part or a dissociative part or a pleasure seeker that is not at all about the critic's track. And it's about kind of like, look at me over here, everything's fine. And
Hmm.
and it just knows how to kind of take the focus off the pain.
And if you would identify that part, the part that's, trying to take away the pain or deflecting or, putting up a smoke screen, if you will, um, what would that part potentially be doing? Again, we get roll hypothetical on that.
What would it be doing with regard to?
Making somebody feel better about the other parts, like the critic and all that. Are we talking about maybe somebody gravitating toward maybe an addiction?
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. The pleasure seeking part would be like part that overeats or overdrinks or has a shopping problem. Yeah,
Gotcha. Okay.
right.
Huh.
Hmm.
How many different parts could there possibly be? Is it endless?
Some people say endless. Dr. Dick Schwartz, the founder of this system, I believe he says that it's common that we have like as many as 50 to 60 active parts. There might be sort of dormant parts that don't really wake up until certain circumstances come around.
Is that a trigger?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like some sort of developmental trigger in your life that you weren't prepared for, and all of a sudden it brings up. I oftentimes talk about, thinking of ourselves as standing on a stage with our parts, and then we have a foreground set of parts, a midground, and a background set of parts that typically kind of line up with us.
Wow. Is this the same thing as, and we're going to get into the idea of the self in just a moment, but would this also be defined as multiple personalities, or is vastly different than what that it
It's
traditionally is?
exactly what it is ultimately. It's just that what used to be called multiple personality disorder today is dissociative identity disorder. That is a very extremified version of what we're all living in.
So when you talk about, you hear that term multiple personalities right away, it's like, whoa, you know, who are you today? This is,
Right.
it's actually normal and okay.
It's totally normal and it's absolutely okay. And one thing that I'll say on that, Steve, that I think helps tie this together is the concept of self and what that is and where it came from, and why. One of the reasons why that concept is particularly foreign to Westerners, and one of the thoughts of why that is the idea philosophically, religiously, of original sin, that Westerners are largely reared in some way with that idea of being born in a state of original sin, right? And say in Buddhist, in Eastern philosophies, that doesn't exist anywhere. That idea that we're born in original sin, and so this idea of self was really an idea that largely came from Buddhism. That we have an essential self. Sure, we have all these different parts, and we can be in relationship or out of relationship with them, but that we have this essential. It's sort of like the difference between, in the West, we're really good at theory and analysis. That's one of our real strengths, right? But we're not that strong on experience. And in Buddhism, traditionally, it wasn't a huge emphasis on theory and analysis. It was actually primarily sort of a flip. It was a primary emphasis on experience. And that's where the Buddhists discovered the self, was through thousands of years of experiential insight and meditation.
How do you, in a sentence, how would you define the self?
The self. It is boy, that's a good challenge. The self is, from an IFS and Buddhist perspective, as I understand it, the self is our essential truth. It is our essential nature. It is our essential capacity for clarity, for compassion, for joy, for presence. And we all have it. And when we are theorizing and analyzing, it's not so obvious that we have a self. But when we are in experience with our parts, it becomes much more clear.
How does I don't know if there's a hierarchy here, but you have the parts, you have self. Is self sitting on top of the parts?
I think you could think of it that way. I oftentimes think of the self as sitting in the middle and the parts kind of around, and sometimes they're stuck on the self, or they're wedged in there. They're hyper blended, which is oftentimes what people bring those parts to therapy. Why they're coming to therapy is to deal with those parts that are so blended, that don't have any awareness of self.
Would you say that self is the core for all of us?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and the
Hmm.
longer I do this work, like I work with clients all the time who understandably, they come in with kind of a strong skeptical part. Right. Part of them is like, I'm not so sure about this. This sounds kind of weird, or I'm not, and that's fine. And in IFS, we make room for that. We really do. We don't try to argue with that part or convince it out of its position. We say, hey, that's okay. It makes sense that you'd be skeptical. This is a very foreign idea in a lot of ways to the West. And
Hmm.
so, from a theory and an analytical perspective, the self doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, because theory and analysis are oftentimes being guided by parts, whereas self is just self.
So it's my understanding. with most modalities, if you're not fully on board to accept it, uh, heal, make change, it's usually not going to work. So if somebody's very skeptical, is that can that be challenging there?
Sure. Yeah. It's really cool though, because people will oftentimes say, I'm not so sure about this. I'm really feeling skeptical. And in that same moment, Steve, I'll say, I think it's really great that you're aware of that part of you that's skeptical. And
Hmm.
I want you to try and let that part know that even though it's skeptical and it's not sure about any of this, it's welcome here.
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah, because you're tying it into the part, and that's, I mean, perfectly normal for somebody to be skeptical, but now you're giving it a destination. Oh, one of your parts is skeptical. Okay,
Yeah,
this one over here isn't, or this one is not even aware. We haven't even gotten
right.
to that.
Yeah, or this part really likes this, but the skeptical part is kind of, sort of sowing seeds of doubt.
So when you work with somebody using the IFS model,
Yeah.
um, how does the part of self come into play there?
How does self come into play?
Yeah.
Um, so when someone comes in and they're really blended with, say a critic part, let's say they have a critic part, they have a mean boss, and this mean boss really triggers this critical part of them to keep them on their toes at all times so that their boss doesn't get mad at them and cause them to already feel underneath what an exile feels, which is that they're no good and that maybe they're an imposter in some sense. So traditional talk therapy, we talk as the imposter, as the critic, as the part that doesn't feel like it's got any worth. And it's not that there wouldn't be any value in that. But the problem is that what would be missing is an experiential process of realizing that you're not those parts. And that in fact, you're not only not those parts, but you're exactly what those parts are looking for, but they don't know
We're getting very deep.
it.
So that last thing you just said, I want to try and process that one. Um, say that again.
Yeah, you as the essential self are exactly, as a resource, as a viable and available resource, you are exactly what the parts are looking for, but they don't know it. And that's part of why the person's in distress, is because they don't have parts that wired developmentally in a way that came to witness and understand the self as being kind of the core of who they are.
I'm gathering here, and I want you to correct me or refine what I'm saying, Scott. But it seems that without the experience, the parts are kind of lost. It
Yeah.
does. It's their role is not really cemented. It's almost like
Yeah.
hypothetical unless you've experienced something.
Yeah.
Like for example, let's say one of your parts is telling you that you're not good enough.
Yeah.
Unless there's evidence and the experience there, it's not going to stick. Same on the reverse side, same exact thing. If you've got a part saying you're a good person, you really are, the part needs proof. It's just not, that's just even if you say to yourself, I'm a good person. All right, I think you're halfway there. How many people do that? How many people look in the mirror and say, you're good? It's rare,
Right.
but it
Right.
sounds like the parts need evidence.
They do. Yeah, they need experiential evidence,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And when they're looking, usually at first especially, they're looking for that from the therapist. And that's fine. The therapist can be a substitute for that for a time, but essentially what we're trying to do in IFS work is to help the parts to realize, to experience, not in a mental way, because that doesn't really have a lot of currency.
Sure.
um, but in an experiential way, for them to recognize and realize, oh wow, this guy Steve or Scott or whoever has something in there that I want. There's some sort of quality of calm and compassion and clarity and courage that this person has that I want, that I'm lacking, that I keep looking for in bad relationships or bad jobs or alcohol or drugs or whatever. This person inside actually has qualities, experiential qualities of self that are like um, they're like food to the parts.
So they have to be fed.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Mm.
they're powerfully undernourished or misnourished or yeah, of self.
Tell us about a situation in working with somebody um, where even you using IFS, there was maybe some challenge. Again, this is all confidential, but just, where you realize that this person's parts are, they've got some stuff going on, and it's a little bit more of a challenge today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's especially the case when people have parts, like this is kind of a generalization, but like when I work with people who have really heady jobs, like engineers or computer scientists or something like that, where they
Mm,
spend a lot of time up in their head and they're really good at theorizing and analyzing and problem solving,
gotcha.
right? They're super, super smart in their mental capacity, but all of that smartness, we call it SPS, it's called smart person syndrome.
Really?
and
I have that. No, I'm kidding. Far
and
from.
it and it makes it really hard for people like that who are really heady or oriented to
Totally.
drop into their body and allow an experience to unfold naturally without any of that kind of control. And so those kind of people usually take a little longer to kind of get the feel for this, for those smart, heady thinking parts to kind of go, oh, wait a minute, it's okay for us to relax and let this happen. This is natural. This is good. It takes a little while for them to get there.
Mm. I can see that, and there's people I know that are like that. And when I talk a little spiritual, I don't preach anything, but and that's not religion connected, just being more spiritual, or things like there's no coincidences. That's my belief. Um,
Yeah,
Person with that mental capacity, very logic driven. They're not buying it. They're not accepting it. It's just no, it does not compute.
right. And it takes them a while to realize that that's probably, it's interesting, right? That their inability or temporary difficulty with getting IFS is emblematic of usually a lot of the problems they're having in their life. You know what I mean? Like they don't listen when their partner is talking to them, or they don't seem very grounded. They seem like they're caught up in their head all the time. They
Mm,
can never kind of just relax. And so that comes into the session, of course, and takes a while for those parts to realize, oh, wait a minute, there's actually a good reason to calm down and be more experiential. It's not just some waste of time.
mm. Um, but they came to you in the first place. So there must have been something in them that said
Yeah.
the traditional talk therapy isn't working,
Right.
isn't
Yeah.
working.
Yeah, and like when people have just sort of general conflicts in their life, phase of life issues, relational conflicts, talk therapy can be great. It really can. But when there's a really unresolved, underlying traumatic series of issues that's going on that talk therapy isn't getting to the bottom of, that's where something like IFS makes sense.
Interesting. You brought it to light. I've never heard of it before.
Yeah.
How long has it been around?
Um, since the late 80s, early 90s.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dick Schwartz did a lot of study. He has done a lot of study on different kinds of wisdom traditions throughout the world that have helped to inform his concept of what IFS is and what it isn't.
Why do you think it's getting more spotlight now? Is it more of us are looking for a more holistic route to heal and figure this all out?
I think that's got to be something to do with it. I think that a lot of people who come to me again and again, Steve, are people who have been through the system of therapy a lot.
Yeah,
And uh, more often than not, they are frustrated,
I get it.
right? They've not gotten what they needed. And IFS, I think, fills a certain void that has been unfilled for a long time in this industry. And if you think about it, I've been thinking about this lately that like if you go all the way back to Sigmund Freud, and his whole idea was, well, he had a lot of ideas, but one of his ideas that's most well known was this sort of parts system, three parts: id, ego, superego. There's three aspects of our humanity. One was like the impulsive drives, the other was the ego itself, which he sort of saw as the self, and then the superego, which is this moral ego, that in many ways is informed by the idea of original sin, that we are born bad and we need this overarching superego to keep us in check.
I don't run deep in terms of the original sin. I'd have to study that more. Um, I don't think I align with that. I think when we're born, it's a clean slate, and I really
Uh-huh.
believe, you have two babies born, they're the same. You know,
Uh-huh.
different backgrounds. Yes, I get it. Different parents. Aside from the genetics, and aside, assuming they're both healthy, um, yeah, and that's where it begins. That's where the challenges begin. Things that they're exposed to as they're 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yeah.
7, and all of that. And that
Yeah.
defines their parts.
Right. Absolutely. That hugely
Mm,
defines their parts, as well as whatever degree of experience they have growing up,
yeah,
where caregivers or teachers or people in their life or experiences give them a sense of awe, of wonder, of something bigger than them, whether that's having an incredible interest in nature, and something that is complex and beautiful and bigger than them. And then I think those people oftentimes can have a better sense of what self is.
gotcha. I know this runs deep, but this heals and helps.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
And I've been through, traditional therapy. I'm always transparent. Needed a therapist, call it like, 12 years ago, for a situation. Situation represented itself in some form. I re-engaged that therapist, and I saw, yeah, just maybe he was different, but when we talk about logic, he was all about, the facts, the figures, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, but wait a minute, I have emotions over here. I have, my parts need some help over here. He wasn't, that wasn't what he was about, and I had to end it
Yeah.
because it wasn't working for me.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure, it's similar to what a lot of people say,
Yeah.
with traditional, is cognitive behavior therapy. Essentially, that's regular therapy, right?
It's one of the types. Yeah. Yeah. It's one
Okay,
of the types of talk therapy.
gotcha. Um,
Yeah.
so interesting, Scott. How do we find you? If somebody wants to learn more about this, kind of, peel back some layers and see how it can be impactful for them. I know you can help anybody anywhere. How do they find you?
Yeah. So I'm based out of California, and they can find me at beyondwordpsychotherapy.com, or give me a call at 510-735-8868 and see if we're a good fit.
It's been a pleasure having some of my parts hang out with your parts today.
Absolutely. Thank you so
It's
much,
so,
Steve.
it's so weird to say, but it's true, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
It is. Amazing.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. We'll talk soon. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, I mean, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.